Good evening from Bangkok, good afternoon and good morning, and welcome to our very first knowledge presentation session for the YAR knowledge sharing meeting. It's my great pleasure to be your moderator today. I'm not a youth researcher, unfortunately. Our proposed moderator, our youth moderator, had a connection problem, so I will be taking you through this session today. My name is Sue Vise and I work with UNESCO in Bangkok, and it has been my honour to be part of the steering committee for Youth as Researchers over the past year and a bit. So the way that this session is going to work is we have 3 teams of researchers from Africa. They will each present their research results, and then we will be hearing from some technical advisors to have some discussion around those findings. What are some of the ways that they could be improved? What are the ways some of those findings could be used to take further action? So to move into it, the first speaker I know well because he's in 2 teams. He's in one of my teams as well, Max Amanu. And Max is representing the regional team that worked for Southern and Eastern Africa, and they will be presenting their research on learning in Africa during the COVID-19 pandemic. So over to you, Max.
Thank you so much. Like she clearly stated that my name is Max Amanu. I am from Uganda, and I am the research team lead for Southern and Eastern African team. So I'll be taking you through this. So this is our team. Next slide, please. Yes, so Southern and Eastern African team selected education as a thematic area to focus on, and much as the team members come from Eastern and Southern African team, we have respondents from all the 54 African countries. So our topic was learning and COVID-19 in Africa, and we were trying to examine how COVID-19 has impacted learning, particularly on the lives of the young people in African continent. Next, please. Yes, so this is our team. Like I stated earlier, that the team is from Southern and Eastern Africa. So here is myself, who is the lead, and the rest of the members are coming from Madagascar, Mozambique, Tanzania, Zimbabwe, and of course, Uganda, where I also happen to come from. Next, please. So this was our research question that we were trying to answer how COVID-19 impacted the lives of the young people in Africa, particularly in terms of learning. So for us to arrive at this, what really motivated us to look into education as a thematic area, and of course, its impact on learning, was that education has a relationship which it shares with other sectors, and it's one of the key drivers of other sectors. So for us to have a recovery of COVID-19, negative impact which it has had in education and also other sectors, if we need to tackle education, the challenges surrounding education, so that once it gets back on board sustainably, it will be able to help in the recovery of other sectors. Next, please. So this was sort of a methodology, how we were able to do the research. Just like many other teams, for the safety of our members and the safety of the respondents to the surveys, we did the research online, and we prepared a survey and sent it out to different educational institutions, to youth organizations, and also to youth around our network ourselves, to respond on how COVID has affected them in terms of education. Next slide, please. So In terms of gender identification, this is how the spread of respondents were. And 49% of them were male, 47 were female, and others who either did not want to identify with any of this or did not want to disclose their gender identity were 4%. Next, please. Yes, so like I said earlier, much as the team is from Southern and Eastern African region, we focused, we got responses from all other African countries, 54 African countries, which happen to have been divided into regions. So you can see the highest number of responses came from Southern Africa, which is not surprising because they are part of, as Southern and Eastern African region were part of the core team. So it happens that Southern and Eastern African region has had the highest respondents, followed by the least being North Africa. Next, please. Yes, so the we are here, the key findings. So I'm going to focus on the most interesting and next slide, please. Okay. So one of the surprising finding was that COVID-19 itself made people to go to adapt to online learning. And of course, online learning would mean that somehow you need to have a curriculum out there, which you are following while you're, because of the exams to be done at the end. So you cannot just be reading anyhow. You need somehow to have a curriculum which you are following to generate your reading material. So 3 out of 4 youth or students from Africa reported that they did not have the required, the necessary curriculum relevant to their fields of study or their courses or their programs in their institutions of learning, say for example, the university websites, which made it very difficult for them to transition to online learning. Next. And the second one is that because of still the online learning, there were different dynamics in which people responded to this. And of course, some people actually during the pandemic had already applied before to start their courses before that year. So we asked our respondents to state among those who applied to join the program or to start studying during the actual pandemic itself, in terms of distribution from urban to rural areas, how were they able to start? How many of them? And only 13% from the rural areas were able to start their studies during the pandemic, and 35% from the urban setting. And of course, this is also comes from other challenges like the internet connectivity, the electricity from the rural setting that has hampered this. Next. And then in terms of online learning itself, the youth reported that the teachers or their instructors, they don't have the required knowledge to deliver online learning. And this 62% is a very big number. That means that the majority of the youth did not have effective learning received from the teachers, because also it was new to most of them. And this has even more impact on the public institutions than the private ones. Next. So having had the interesting or striking findings, what are we trying to propose that we start or should be done to alleviate what has already been created or the impact it has had in terms of education or learning in the African institutions, 54 African countries. So the recommendations are channeled to the stakeholders who are going to work on it, who are going to be responding. And these include institutions of higher learning. Like we had earlier, there are issues surrounding the curriculum, which is directly, can be tackled by education institutions. Then we also have governments. They have a hand in this, and also NGOs like international NGOs, private sector, social sector, and also the international NGOs like organizations like the UNESCO and other UN agencies to respond to this. So next, please. The very first one proposed recommendation we have is that because the vaccination, or because the COVID-19 has led to the closure of schools, and some were failure to get back to class, and also and the dynamics which surround the urban and the rural setting. For us to harmonize this, one of the easiest way forward is that governments in African countries should prioritize the COVID-19 vaccination program targeted specifically to teachers and the students, so that they are able to, we can make it possible for online learning to resume, and this will help in the standardization of the learning and examination, and of course reduce the exclusion and inequality already existing, that only some regions like the urban setting has more people studying and the rural setting has less people. So in a long run, this can have a widening gap of, and reduced inclusion of people due to their regional location. So that's why we are saying that governments in African countries should make this a priority, that, okay, students and teachers should be part of the members who get the vaccination, I can say first, and they should be part of the vaccination priority list, so that the online learning and inline, I mean in physical and in-person classes can resume. Next, please. Yes, so thank you. So to also prevent, I already hinted on this, preventing further inequality and exclusion in education institutions. So there should be need for a collaboration with the service providers, just in case before all these other remedies are put in place to enable in-person classes. Remember, the online classes are already ongoing, but some of the challenges surrounding the online classes is accessibility to internet, but not just internet, stable and affordable internet connectivity for everyone. So most of the learners from Africa, since most of the African countries are developing and least developed countries, there is a challenge surrounding access to internet connectivity, and of course access to resources like tools for learning. So there needs to be a collaboration between the education institutions of learning and the service providers of internet, so that they are able to enable, before the in-person classes come in, enable the online classes to move smoothly, but also for the purposes of hybrid learning, because that seems to be the new trend. Because to incorporate the hybrid sort of learning, both in-person and online learning, there needs to be a mechanism in place that can harmonize the lack of access to internet, and of course lack of access to learning tools. Next. And that actually, this recommendation builds up on the previous one, in a sense that institutions of higher learning should have sufficient and effective, ICT department, which can be able to do what we discovered in the past. Like the students reported that they do not have a necessary curriculum in their institutions of learning, and which will in turn, of course, widen the gap between those who are able to learn, but they do not have the required reading material, the required course outline, which they can follow for the purposes of uniformity. So because of that, institutions of higher learning in African countries should have staff members update their website with this information, just like for most of their counterparts in the other parts of the world, so that they can be able to easily transition to online learning. Next, please. Yes, so some of the issues that came out is that learning experience online needs to be improved so that it benefits both the institutions and the students involved in it. So we propose that institutions of learning should commit to capacity building of their lecturers, teachers, and instructors with digital skills, because some of the issues reported by the students was that they do not have the necessary the teachers do not have the necessary skills to deliver effective learning, especially in public institutions, because private institutions try to take it upon themselves to do capacity building. What about in public institutions? That means the students do not have the same experience. And of course, also Ministry of Education has a role to play to disseminate the learning framework that can harmonize online learning, because if people are doing online learning or hybrid, there needs to be a framework to harmonize all these differences. Next, please. Yes, so thank you so much. This is our what we bring on the table. And in case you need to reach us for further discussion, for suggestions, these are the contacts you can reach out to, so that we can see how best we can streamline these recommendations, these findings, and come up with tangible, actionable policies that can be able to sustain not only the education sector in African continent for today, but also in preparation for other future endemics, pandemics, and of course, supporting the recovery of all the other sectors. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Max. And I'm sure that a lot of people watching, no matter where you're from, can resonate with many of those things that were findings from the team in Africa. Perhaps a big difference is the vaccination rate in Africa being slower than some other areas. So the next speaker is from the Central African team. And the Central African team wanted to focus on a different topic. They were particularly concerned with how the pandemic has affected the livelihoods of young people in Central Africa. So those of you who were in the opening session will already recognize Dr. Legrand, who is here again to present on behalf of his team from Central Africa.
Bonjour tout le monde. Merci Sue pour la parole. Je suis Legrand Chirumwami et je veux présenter pour le compte de l'Afrique centrale. Je ne sais pas si vous me captez très bien. Ah, ok, merci. Ok, si vous pouvez commencer par la toute première diapositive, ça c'est la deuxième. Please go to the first slide. The first one. Ok. L'équipe de l'Afrique centrale a parlé sur la situation des entreprises de jeunes de l'Afrique centrale pendant la COVID-19. Et la coordination de l'équipe au niveau de l'UNESCO était assurée par Madame Yvonne Matuturu, qui est coordinatrice du projet YAR au niveau de l'Afrique centrale pour les comptes de l'UNESCO. Et next. L'équipe de recherche au niveau de l'Afrique centrale est composée était composé de 7 personnes, dont moi qui vous parle, le prof Dr Legrand Chirumwami. J'interviens partout de la République démocratique du Congo et j'étais le team leader, bien chef d'équipe dans le cadre des YAR, Youth as Researchers de l'UNESCO au niveau de l'Afrique centrale. Et j'avais Dr Zola Donita qui nous vient du Tchad, Suriel Esseng Edou qui vient du Gabon, et Iloki Kombo Harmonie est de la République du Congo, communément appelée Congo-Brazzaville. Et il y a Aline Ngalula qui est aussi de la République démocratique du Congo, et Messaline Fomo du Cameroun et Kennedy Yuta du Cameroun. C'est ça la composition de l'équipe de recherche dans le cadre de l'Afrique centrale. Next. Next. Comme nous le savons tous, la pandémie à COVID-19, depuis décembre 2019, il a commencé en Chine et puis il a frappé vraiment le monde et plusieurs domaines de la vie et plusieurs domaines au niveau mondial, ou plusieurs pays, pour ne pas dire tous les pays, ont vraiment été touchés. Et c'est là, d'abord la santé, la santé des gens, donc de la population mondiale a été touchée, et aussi l'éducation, qui a vraiment subi beaucoup de secousses avec des mesures telles que la fermeture des écoles et des universités, et qui a obligé pour certains de recourir de recourir au système en ligne, donc de l'éducation en ligne. Il y a aussi l'économie qui a été frappée, mais aussi les sociales, parce qu'il y a eu beaucoup de restrictions, les gens n'avaient plus toute leur mobilité, toute leur liberté, et cela a eu un impact sur les sociales. Mais bon, pour cette étude, nous, on s'est penché du côté de l'économie et nous avons voulu comprendre comment les entreprises de jeunes de l'Afrique centrale se sont comportées pendant la COVID-19. Et donc, c'était ça la grande question de recherche pour l'équipe de l'Afrique centrale. Mais bon, pourquoi on s'est posé cette question? C'est pour comprendre la situation des jeunes entrepreneurs avant et pendant la COVID-19. Donc, on ne sait pas dire avant et après parce que nous sommes toujours dans la période de la COVID-19. Et donc, on a voulu comprendre avant la COVID et pendant la COVID comment les entreprises de jeunes se sont comportées. Et aussi, cela a été, nous avons fixé notre recherche sur cette question pour arriver à faire un plaidoyer, n'est-ce pas, faire un plaidoyer auprès des jeunes, un plaidoyer, pardon, auprès des institutions nationales, régionales, mais aussi internationales, en faveur des jeunes entrepreneurs. Peut-être qu'on peut se demander pourquoi les entreprises de jeunes, pourquoi vous êtes penchés sur la jeunesse. D'habitude, les jeunes entrepreneurs sont trop fragiles, donc leurs entreprises sont trop fragiles compte tenu du fait que c'est souvent des entreprises qui ne sont pas très résilientes et donc du coup quand il y a une petite perturbation, cela peut avoir des impacts catastrophiques sur leurs entreprises. Next. La collecte des données a été faite en ligne, comme nous étions toujours dans le contexte de COVID-19, et nous avons ciblé les entrepreneurs jeunes dont l'âge varie entre 18 et 35 ans. Donc, c'était ça le grand critère pour classer les jeunes entreprises. Donc, ce sont des entreprises qui n'ont pas beaucoup de temps de fonctionnement et aussi qui sont gérées par des jeunes entre 18 et 35 ans. Et 7 pays ont été concernés pour la collecte des données. Il s'agit de la République démocratique du Congo, la République du Congo, le Gabon, le Cameroun, le Tchad, le Burundi et la République centrafricaine. Alors, nous avons utilisé Excel, SPSS, R et R pour l'analyse des données et nous avons eu ces données dans les contacts des différents startups, les incubateurs, les réseaux sociaux et les structures étatiques. Next, please. Alors, pour ce qui concerne les résultats, la majorité des répondants étaient de la République démocratique du Congo, suivi par le Tchad, le Cameroun, le Congo-Brazzaville, le Gabon, la République centrafricaine, le Burundi et puis le Burundi. Et nous avons vu que la majorité des jeunes entrepreneurs sont des hommes qui ont représenté plus de 74%, tandis que la tranche d'âge la plus répandue, c'était entre 26 et 35 ans. Et la majorité sont des universitaires et ces jeunes entrepreneurs résident beaucoup plus dans les provinces. Next. Next. OK. Pendant la COVID, avant la COVID-19, la majorité d'entreprises de jeunes étaient en bonne situation, mais pendant maintenant la situation, pendant la COVID-19, 2 tiers de ces entreprises étaient en mauvaise situation. Par contre, pour ce qui concerne l'aide financière du gouvernement, seulement des entreprises sur 94 que nous avons eues dans notre enquête avaient été soutenues par le gouvernement et 5 sur les 94 avaient eu l'aide financière des autres institutions. Next. D'une manière générale, pendant maintenant la période de la COVID-19, la majorité des entrepreneurs sont dans une phase de reconstitution. Ils sont en train de chercher à s'armer pour bien faire face à la COVID-19 compte tenu des nouvelles règles de la pandémie. Et donc, la majorité cherche encore à s'adapter à la difficulté de la COVID-19. Next. Parmi les défis majeurs que les jeunes ont reconnus pendant la période ici de COVID-19, il y a la réduction de la production, les faibles pouvoirs d'achat, les difficultés des fonctionnements, la restriction du mouvement, les problèmes d'importation et exportation, manque des investisseurs et partenaires, faible accès aux matières premières, faible ou voire même aucun accès aux capitaux et problème de remboursement des crédits. Et comme stratégie, ils ont utilisé la réduction des ressources humaines, le marketing digital et surtout les réseaux sociaux, la diversification des services et produits. Certains ont dû suspendre différentes activités et aussi il y a l'utilisation de la monnaie électronique et la baisse du prix la baisse du prix des produits était aussi signalée pour certains d'autres. Et aussi, ils ont recherché des appuis financiers et subventions. Next. Comme recommandation, nous voudrions à ce que les différents ministères de la jeunesse et de l'entrepreneuriat puissent appliquer des politiques publiques qui sont inclusives et qui qui implique aussi les jeunes, mais aussi qu'ils votent des lois, des réglementations et actions concrètes qui peuvent promouvoir la jeunesse. Ils devraient aussi impliquer la jeunesse dans les instances de prise de décision et surtout soutenir les jeunes du secteur informel pour qu'ils se professionnalisent. Appuyer l'encadrement des jeunes entrepreneurs, surtout par les incubateurs. Pour ce qui est des institutions financières, les recommandations que les jeunes ont données, c'est simplifier les procédures d'accès au crédit et rendre accessibles les crédits ou subventions aux jeunes et réduire les taux d'intérêt, surtout pour les jeunes entrepreneurs. Next. Pour les structures des Nations Unies, dont l'UNESCO, les jeunes voudraient qu'il y ait participation des jeunes dans différents programmes ou projets appuyés dans différents pays, mais aussi mettre en place les systèmes de redevabilité des États, surtout au profit des jeunes, et organiser des formations et ateliers de capacitation au profit des jeunes entrepreneurs. Pour la fin, aux jeunes entrepreneurs, les différentes recommandations étaient telles qu'il fallait qu'ils diversifient leurs activités pour arriver à élargir les champs d'action. Aussi, ils devraient s'adapter au numérique et nouer des partenariats à tous les niveaux. C'est un peu ça l'essentiel de nos résultats. Next. Et nous disons thank you, merci. Murakose.
Merci beaucoup, Legrand. Again, a very interesting presentation and highlighting a number of the other issues facing young people in Africa. Our last speaker, and I understand we have a speaker switch here because we had another connection issue, will be representing the Nigeria team. And the reason we had a Nigeria team is because we had specific countries that had a really, really high response rate. And Nigeria was one of those 4 or 5 countries globally that had a really strong interest in being involved in YAR. So we decided to set up a national team just for Nigeria. And this team was also looking at learning and impact on learning and opportunities for learning during the pandemic. And I believe we're going to hear from Olanike Timipa as the speaker on behalf of this team. Is that correct? Are you there, Olanika? Okay, over to you.
Yes, I'm here. Hi, Sue. Thank you. Good day, everyone. My name is Olanike Timipa, and I'll be presenting on behalf of the YAR Nigerian team. The slides, please. Our team assessed learning opportunities among Nigerian youth during the COVID-19 lockdown. We are a team of 8. Next slide, please. We are a team of 8. Babajide Charles being the team lead, Portia Ozema, David Otujo, Charles Falajiki, Ianoluwa Emmanuel, Efetubo Stephanie, Mohamed Suleiman, and myself. Next slide, please. This topic was particularly important to us because the COVID-19 lockdown led to school closure across more than 190 countries, with about 1.6 million learners, being forced out of school as a result of the school closure. In Nigeria, schools were closed for a period of 6 months, leading to a large number of young people having to stay at home, and a great barrier was created by the pandemic to their education. Online learning therefore became the available solution to bridge the gap, the learning gap created by the COVID-19 pandemic. Next slide, please. This survey examined the perception of young people towards learning and learning opportunities during the COVID-19 lockdown. The study also identified the barriers young people in Nigeria face in accessing online learning during the COVID-19 lockdown. Next slide, please. Our study adopted an empirical research design and collected data from 180 Nigerian youths from across the 6 geopolitical zones. We collected data from, this study classified young people and youth as people between the ages of 18 to 35 years who are currently enrolled in the formal institution with the aid of a closed-ended online questionnaire. Next slide, please. The survey revealed digital divides among youths living in urban communities and those living in the rural communities. 57% of young people who live in the urban communities had sufficient access to online learning, while 45% of those in rural communities were able to access online learning throughout the COVID-19 lockdown. 71% of the respondents disagreed that Nigerian learning institutions were able to put in necessary measures to ensure the availability of online learning for their students. Next slide, please. Funding sources for online learning were relatively poor. 47% of youth who were able to access online learning during the COVID-19 school lockdown were able to do so from their individual funds, while only 4% of Nigerian youth received support from the Nigerian government to access online learning during the COVID-19 lockdown. Next slide, please. Despite the challenges that Nigerian youth experienced during this period, it was only 35% of Nigerian youth did not access online learning all through the 6 months of school lockdown in Nigeria. And only 7% of those who were able to access online learning were able to do so on a daily basis. The survey also revealed that female youths were unable to access online learning compared to their male counterparts. And this is as a result of cultural belief and gender biases in the country. House chores, a lot of female youths were more inclined to performing house chores as compared to the male counterparts who had access to and all the time to access online learning. Next slide, please. The survey also identified barriers young people in Nigeria face in access online learning. These barriers include unreliable electricity, limited internet connectivity, unaffordability of data, and inaccessibility of digital devices. Digital devices are expensive, and a large number of Nigerian youth were unable to access these devices for the purpose of online learning. The other barriers identified also is that a large number of Nigerians do not have adequate knowledge on how to operate online learning platforms. Online learning, Nigerian youth are, respondents believe that online learning is efficient if all of these barriers are being mitigated. However, Nigerian youth also believe that online learning could be cheaper than in-person learning. Also, that the teaching methodology that is being adopted and used on online learning platforms are more effective from the traditional forms of teaching. Next slide, please. Our key recommendations include that Nigerian government needs to formulate policies and increase funding to Nigerian educational institutions to enable accessible and inclusive online learning for Nigerian youth. The international development communities should assist the Nigerian government to invest in infrastructure to ensure that Nigerian youth, regardless of their location, are able to access affordable internet services, reliable electricity, and a wide coverage of internet connectivity. The Nigerian government and educational institutions also need to subsidize digital products, digital devices, such as laptops, smartphones, for youth, particularly those in the rural communities, to enable them access online learning. We also recommend that UNESCO reinforces capacity development among Nigerian youth, particularly in the area of digital literacy. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much. Again, I think you can see from the three presenters that we have the depth of the research that they've been able to cover over the last few months in all three of these projects. Next, we're going to go to what we call our technical advisors to get their reactions and thoughts about the research that's been conducted and how this could be used in the future. So our first advisor is Dr. Austin Tam George. Dr. Austin is the Executive Director of the Institute of Communication and Corporate Studies. Sorry, I can't read all of that, in Nigeria. So obviously a lot of experience with the last team and the issues that have been going on in Nigeria. So over to you, Dr. Austin.
Thank you, Sue. I have to commend UNESCO for putting this together. You know, this is a wonderful opportunity, you know, for young people to express themselves and share experiences across different regions across the continent. I want to also thank the young teams across the continent, East Africa, Central Africa, and West Africa, for conducting this kind of researches across the continent and presenting very, very interesting findings. Some of the recommendations I would like to move to have already been addressed by some of the presenters, but I would like to point out some very important points. You see, one of the key elements of conventional education is that it requires us to learn and interact very closely, physically, and sometimes in physically enclosed places that we sometimes call classrooms. So there is a great deal of that sense of intimacy in the learning space. But with the outbreak of COVID-19, a very highly transmissible disease, we came to a situation where people could no longer take for granted the physicality of education, and so people had to be geographically dispersed, geographically disaggregated in order for them to learn. Did we in Africa have the kind of technological infrastructure to respond to the kind of disruptions that COVID-19 caused? Obviously not. We are seeing more and more from the findings of these teams that the African continent still has a lot to do in terms of broadband penetration, closing the digital divide between urban settlers and those who live in rural areas. We've also seen, especially in the case of Nigeria, where as much as 71%, according to the researchers, as much as 71% disagreed very strongly that they did not get online learning support from their government. This is a very high number. Now, the implication in terms of policy for me would be that rather than continue to see online learning modalities as alternative platforms of learning, maybe what we should learn from the COVID-19 disruption is that we should in fact integrate digital education, online learning, as part of a larger spectrum of educational offerings. We shouldn't wait until the next pandemic breaks before we begin to scramble for online responses as alternative forms. My suggestion would be that in fact, we should integrate online learning as part of a normalized curriculum in our educational system across the continent. Now, what that would mean is that we would not also be hoping that as soon as there's a disruption, that teachers will quickly switch over to online digital modes of teaching. No, what I think we should do by way of suggestion is that maybe we should rethink our curriculum in the centers of teacher training, for instance, in colleges of education or faculties of education across the continent. We may now decide to include online teaching methodology as part of the offerings in our curriculum so that, you know, as Max in Uganda and FA in Nigeria mentioned, we cannot take it for granted that as soon as there is a disruption, teachers, especially those in the public school sector, will simply learn how, you know, switch to online modes of learning. They themselves, the teachers themselves, will need formal training. And what the COVID-19 experience has taught us is that sometimes these disruptions can happen suddenly and we may not have sufficient time for training. The answer, therefore, would be to integrate online learning methodologies, teaching methodology as part of the teacher training curriculum that we need to offer in our teacher training institutions, such as colleges of education and faculties of education. What I'm saying in short is that we need a more institutionalized response to this crisis, so that we you know, whoever is going to respond to future crises is already trained in advance, you know, in anticipation of disruptions of this sort. The other point has to do with, I think if you mentioned that, you know, very well in terms of digital penetration. We've seen across the presentations that those who live in rural areas are almost totally excluded in the digital age. The response, I think, would be to work in close partnership with telecoms companies, and Nigeria will have quite a number of them, to set up, to see some of these communities as hotspots. They should be set up as a matter of policy, deliberate policy, as hotspots for learning. You know, if they work very closely with telecoms companies, they will more easily find partners who can set up hotspots in these communities. I say this not just as an educationist myself, but as somebody who has served at cabinet level in government. Some of these things we take for granted in academics are not really things that are considered in government. You know, we still need people who are in government to respond to these things in a structural way. We need not to wait for the next pandemic to break. We need to find partners in the private sector, international agencies, to respond to some of these disruptions. But I believe that there's a disproportionate amount of responsibility that falls on governments across the continent to set the pace for digital education across the continent. Now, we've seen in the case of Nigeria that as much, you know, if we made this presentation, that as much as 35% of learners, young learners in Nigeria, never accessed online learning during the crisis. This is a very, very concerning statistic indeed, because if you have as many as such people totally excluded from online learning experience, what that means is that they've simply been falling through the education gaps. As participants in this forum might know, in Nigeria, even before the COVID-19 crisis, we had the highest number of children out of school, according to UNESCO figures, over 13, a lot of kids out of school. And this has been exacerbated by a very active insurgency that has been going on in the northeast of Nigeria, and now spreading even more ominously across the country. We have seen various disturbing cases of kidnapping of school children. They've made international headlines, so very few people can pretend not to be aware. So COVID-19 is not really the beginning of educational exclusion in Nigeria. We've had very serious cases of kidnapping, as many as thousands of students, kids, kidnapped from their hostels and from their learning classrooms over the past 5 years or so. So what this means is that as part of the structural response to the kind of disruptions, whether it's COVID-19 or whether it's banditry, kidnapping, as we have in Nigeria, perhaps part of the solutions, as in addition to actually ending these menace, may be to make sure that people are able to learn in their homes, in the safety of their homes, before more definitive security measures are put in place. So these are some of the recommendations. I suspect that as we go on in the course of the conversation, we'll share more insights while we hear from other contributors to the forum.
Thank you so much. Excellent insights. And I think that's really great feedback for the groups to think about the recommendations. And it seems you're thinking some of the same things, which is certainly a good sign. We have two more technical advisors, so I will have to ask people to try not to speak quite so long. The next advisor is Dr. Jacqueline Kisato, who is a lecturer in entrepreneurship at the School of Public Health and Applied Human Sciences at Kenyatta University in Kenya. So over to you, Dr. Jacqueline.
Okay, thank you very much. I will ask for my slides to be presented, please. Thank you. So it looks like I'm going to be summarizing some of the things you've said because it tallies with a lot of the thoughts I had. And if we look at it in terms of facts, almost 60% of African youth is under the age of 25. The population of Africa is projected to double by 2050. 16 million young Africans are going to face unemployment. 1 million young people will join the labor force every year, and only 3.7 jobs are created. So this becomes quite dramatic with the COVID pandemic. So what is the COVID pandemic exposed for us? One, education needs to consider the digital platforms because this is going to be the next kind of way of educating. And has been said by the previous speaker, we might have to consider having that in curriculum for high school and for also teacher training colleges. I hope my mic is better now. Okay, thank you. Then we have entrepreneurship. We have to start thinking as young people, entrepreneurship that is sustainable. The idea of having entrepreneurship that is not sustainable will no longer be useful for us. And if you notice, a lot of these businesses were collapsing during this time because they don't have social safety nets. So we need to start thinking innovations, digitalizing, and going across borders to create sustainable businesses. Then also the third important thing, I think, is we need to consider climate change and the threats it has within our community and incorporate this in our business ventures and also other activities that we carry on in our education sectors. Can you please give me the next slide? Thank you. So if you look at what we do in entrepreneurship, a lot of our business is a hustler type of business. You build a business, you only sell, trade on things that are moving, and you do not create a business that is sustainable in the long run. For you to keep a sustainable business, as has been reported in some of the findings, there's need to digitalize, there's need to go into digitalizing and trading across borders. There's need to innovate and create value chains, especially that will create products for the bottom of the pyramid, who sometimes are ignored. And there's also need to create sustainable businesses that are green and inclusive and protecting our environment. Next slide, please. So since I'm part of faculty in a university, then we need to start thinking about education. Young people will need to think of digital competencies for themselves as well as academia. We need to have collaborative teams working across different skills and not just reading and working on your own anymore. We need to have climate awareness even in the education sector. And definitely we have to start thinking creatively, innovatively, and looking beyond just common education. So what you're pushing here is to attain the SDGs. we have to consider having lifelong learning and using the digital platform as a way in which you can democratize education across all sectors. Next slide, please. So I think for the Great Reset, and this has been echoed by all the other presenters, digitalization is key. Technology is very important, the digital divide. There's the idea of the African continental free trade for entrepreneurs. We need to think cross-border trading, and there's the need to start thinking seriously about climate change and how our businesses, our enterprises are affecting the climate. Especially in Africa, you see our plastic pollution and you see all the drainages and the water flows. We have to consider how to stop that. Next slide, please. So I'd like to thank you very much for your listening, and I hope we'll be able to move forward with this. Thank you very much.
Okay, again, very interesting. And obviously, you've been doing your own research on similar topics, which is good. So I hope that you found that the research is aligned with what you've been observing.
Mhm.
Our final technical advisor is Dr. James Kiwi, who's the CEO of Jet Education Services in South Africa. And so over to you, James.
Thanks, Sue. Jacqueline has set the bar quite high for a short input there. Let me start. I'm going to focus on methodology more than content, because I think the others have covered a lot of the content. So a couple of key points. Firstly, very practical suggestion, Max. If you've got background noise, get an app there, free apps. It's called Crisp, K-R-I-S-P. I have no shares in Crisp. It works really well when you've got background noise. Quite often when we do presentations like this, we have kids and things in the background. So absolutely, and we all have it. It's a very simple thing when you do presentations like this. Around the research and the methodology, I found 2 of the 3 research pieces were very strongly focused on the research questions, but maybe the first one was not that clear. It's always important when we think about a piece of research to be very clear on the research questions. The other thing that I didn't see coming through that clearly that I think we can all work on together would be some kind of sampling. I know with these kind of surveys during COVID, we just put out the surveys there and we really hope that people respond. But it's really important to think carefully who you target and how you sample, because if you don't think about the sampling, your findings are a little bit all over the place. It's not a bad thing. I mean, this is how we learn to do research and how we kind of collaborate. But think carefully about your sampling next time. And also when you report on the responses, some of you did that, but you've got to disaggregate those groupings, not only according to gender, but also according to other criteria, particularly criteria that you might want to generalize towards. What I saw in all 3 pieces of research was some interesting research and then a big jump to strong recommendations. Okay, so what I didn't see in all 3 of the research pieces was causality. So how did your research point to your recommendations? I saw quite a few cases like you did some interesting research and then your recommendations were really far and very wide. So be very careful in terms of credibility of your research. It's important to kind of moderate yourself that your findings are in line with your research. So for example, I can't do research on ECD or early grade learning and then make findings about skills development or adult learning. No, those 2 things are too far apart. And so what I found in some of the research is you guys are jumping quite far from your research to your recommendations. I think the other point, Sue, that I think could have been helpful for the teams would have been peer reviewers. And part of what we're doing today is a peer review exercise. But I think it's really important when we do this kind of research is to bring those peer reviewers a bit closer, a bit quicker. Peer reviewers are not always so nice to have with you because they can be quite critical, but you know what they do is they help you come with a quality product and a product that you can defend. So I think those were kind of some methodological things that jumped out at me. Maybe some content things, just very briefly, Sue. The first thing that I think is really important that we see happening in our research at the moment is the question really is access to internet a human right? We saw during the COVID pandemic that if I did not have access to internet, my inequality in my country, if I'm in Nigeria or in South Africa or DRC, really got affected very negatively. So the challenge I would put to the researchers and to the group today is how do we lobby? How do we work together and work with both our own governments, but also agencies like UNESCO and the ILO and the World Bank about talking about internet access as a human right. There's something important about this question that we need to think about as we go into a post-COVID world. That reset that Jacqueline, I think you spoke about just now, I think that's really important. My second point around content will be around pedagogy. I think Dr. Austin spoke about this a little bit. We've got to think about new pedagogies. More online learning, more online teaching means that the teachers have to be trained differently. Most of our teachers are weekly trained, and they definitely don't have a lot of online training. So this is a real issue for us. My own son is a university student at the moment. What I see happening with him is, you know what he does, Sue, maybe I shouldn't say this too loudly. He records the classes and then he plays them at double speed. He says, this is much quicker, Dad. I don't have to sit through all these classes. You know, so there's a lot of things that we need to do, but differently with our young our kids, but also students as they go through new forms of pedagogy. My last point would be around teachers. Today's International Teacher Day, guys. I'm sure you spoke about it earlier today, but teachers are the core, the central part of all our discussions when we talk about education. So how are you talking about teachers? How did your research affect teachers? How did you think about teachers? Not only the pedagogy, but also their training and also the professionalization. There are agencies across Africa like AFTRA, the African Federation for Teacher Regulatory Authorities, and many others that help us work together as countries to enhance the profession and status of teachers. So let me end here. I know it's not easy. We did similar research than you guys did about 18 months ago with teams across the Commonwealth and Southern Africa. Some of the reports were great, and we put them out there and we published them, and the other reports just did not quite make it. And that's okay. You don't have to be successful every time you do the research, but it's really important to look at causality, to have a proper design, to think about your sampling, and to have really strong peer review before we put research out. Thanks, Sue.
Thank you very much. I think there was some really good advice in those suggestions. And yeah, I think that this is part of our peer review process. We have also done another external peer review, written review, but this is great because I think this will help to sharpen the findings from the research. We do have only a short amount of time for questions. So I'm just going to pick a couple of questions out of the chat, but you can reach out through the conference platform to talk to any of the researchers at any time through either the social networking function, or you can actually even meet with them. So I encourage you to do that. But one of the questions that's coming out for all of the teams, and if you can give me a brief answer, from Akwazi, who's quite interested on whether or not any aspects of young people with disabilities was researched in any of the teams, or how did you deal with the issue of young people with disabilities? So perhaps we could start with Max. Are you still with us, Max?
Yes, I'm here.
Did you hear the question? Yeah.
Yes, so to answer the question of the disability, it's a hard fact to take in, but our team, because of the modalities surrounding the data collection process, which was basically reaching people from across the continent, which you nearly have no contact with, we did not incorporate the aspect of disability. We focused more on the other segment of the youth, and which are with the age demographic of 18 to 35. So that is definitely something to look into, but like I said earlier, it's a hard fact to take that we did not put it into consideration. Thank you.
Thanks, Max. What about in Central Africa, Legrand? Were you able to pick up any information relating to youth with disabilities in your study?
Non, merci pour la question. Oui, je suis là. Donc, merci pour la question. On n'a pas inclus cet aspect dans notre recherche. Et je pense que cela a été dit au timing, mais aussi donc, à la manière dont les données ont été collectées, parce que c'était fait en ligne. Donc, on n'a pas eu le réflexe, on n'a pas eu la possibilité de mettre cet aspect. Si tu dois continuer, je pense qu'à la longue, on devrait penser à cette question parce qu'il y a des jeunes en situation d'handicap, des jeunes entrepreneurs. Merci.
Okay, merci, Legrand. And Olenike, did you manage to capture anything relating to youth with disabilities? You've got your mute off now, so you should be able to speak, Olenike.
Unfortunately, we were not able to collect data from youth living with disability, and this was basically because of the peculiarity of our data collection method. We had to collect data virtually and due to the short duration as well. But definitely this is a great factor we'll put into consideration in the future. Thank you.
Okay, so one more very quick question and then we will have to wrap up. There's quite a few questions around the entrepreneurship. And so Geeta has asked, for example, how have you actually specifically defined youth social entrepreneurship or youth businesses? And then we have Faith, who is asking some questions around where is it? How do you, because a lot of young people who are still in school, how do you separate the kind of educational side and what they're doing in terms of entrepreneurship? So Legrand, I don't know if you have any answers on either of those.
Merci, certainement que j'ai une petite réponse à proposer. D'abord, je pense l'avoir dit dans ma présentation, la manière dont nous avons délimité ou bien désigné les entreprises des jeunes, d'abord des entreprises qui n'ont pas beaucoup d'années d'existence et dont les propriétaires, donc le répondant de l'entreprise devrait avoir l'âge compris entre 18 et 35 ans. Donc, c'est comme ça que ce sont presque les deux grands critères que nous avons mis en place pour dire que voilà, ça c'est une entreprise de jeunes parce que dès que le directeur gérant est jeune, et donc on s'est dit que c'est une entreprise de jeunes. Et vraiment, la majorité, c'était des entreprises avec majoritairement moins de 5 ans d'existence. Alors, pour le fait, pour la deuxième question qui concerne le fait qu'un entrepreneur peut être aussi élève ou étudiant, cela ne constituait pas pour nous une barrière parce qu'en réalité, il y en a qui sont étudiants et qui sont entrepreneurs. Peut-être qu'ils sont entrepreneurs dans l'informel et même aussi dans les formels. J'en connais beaucoup localement qui sont étudiants et qui font aussi l'entrepreneuriat. Donc, après leurs heures des classes ou bien d'université, ils peuvent faire l'entrepreneuriat. Merci.
Thank you so much, Legrand. So I think that I would just like to also add a little point about the research for everybody. This was a social research project, and we were designing this on the run to try to adapt to a new situation. So I think that there wasn't the opportunity to delve into some of the depths that a lot of the teams would have liked to. simply because we didn't have the means during a pandemic to do that. So I wonder if there's any final comments from any of the advisors before we wrap up. We have just a few minutes to go.
I can jump in soon. Maybe just best wishes for the team and keep going. A research career is a long, hard journey. And so best wishes for the work that lies ahead. Thanks, Sue.
That's a fantastic sentiment. What about Dr. Jacqueline?
Well, I am very happy to meet young researchers who are interested in carrying on with research. It's a wonderful area. It's fascinating. Once we streamline the areas of size, sampling, we should be able to do great. And your presentations were excellent. Well done.
Thank you so much. And over to you, Dr. Austin. Do you have any other comments or advice?
Yes, it's very gratifying, to hear young scholars, young researchers coming from Africa. Africa has the youngest population in the world, and to see young people, in spite of the constraints, thinking around challenges that confront the continent, especially in the education sector, is a wonderful thing. I encourage all the researchers, you've done very well. Look at the sample size again. I suspect that the COVID actually had limitations on the spread of some of the researches, but I think, the recommendations are valid and are very well connected to the realities we face in the continent. I appreciate the work they've done and kudos to them.
Thank you so much. I think that since we do have just a little bit of time, I wonder if any of our presenters have questions for the technical advisors. Max, do you have any questions that you would like to ask the technical advisors?
Yes, of course, thank you for the opportunity. This goes to most of the technical advisors, but specifically to Dr. James, who highlighted the fact that the findings we have and the connection to the recommendation is a little bit, far-fetched. I was just requesting because at the back of the work, behind the scene, that's what we are trying to relate. However, it appears that in the writing and the uptake of the other side is a little bit maybe disconnected. So requesting for maybe strategies on how best we can communicate our recommendations when they are related, like it comes out that with the relationship with the findings.
Would any of the advisors like to take the question?
I can go quickly, Sue. Max, that's a difficult question. You're only allowed to ask easy questions. I think, Max, that's the difficult thing about research, and I'll be happy on my own time to read something you've written. I don't like PowerPoint. PowerPoint simplifies things too much. But if you've got something written, I will be happy to look at it and just give you a view whether the connection is there, if that'll help you in line with what you're doing, Sue, on my own time.
Okay, that would be fantastic.
Okay, all right.
Go ahead, please.
No, I was wondering if it's entirely true that there's a disconnection between the research findings and the recommendations. In fact, I found very strong connections from Eastern Africa down to West Africa to Central Africa. I thought I saw very strong connections. For instance, in Nigeria, it's very clear that the findings revealed that 71% disagree that government played a role. And in their recommendation, it was very clear that they were suggesting that government should play a greater role in supporting the development of digital infrastructure and making sure that people have access, to broadband. So I think that maybe what we need to look at for is whether, they can expand the scope of the research But I think that the connection between research and recommendations, for me, in my interpretation at least, we are very strong.
Okay, thank you. So Legrand, you'll get the last question or comment. So
Merci, merci pour cet honneur. En fait, je voulais demander aux experts, est-ce que vous pensez que, par exemple, il y a James qui est de l'UNESCO, il y a, je me rappelle pas trop bien les noms, l'autre qui intervient à partir du Nigeria, qui est du cabinet donc du gouvernement, et le prof qui intervient aussi dans le cadre de l'entrepreneuriat. Est-ce que vous pensez que nos pays devraient prendre ça en charge, surtout ce genre de recommandations, parce qu'on ne voudrait pas que ce soit des lettres mortes, mais on voudrait quand même que ces recommandations arrivent jusqu'aux aux derniers acteurs ou bien aux derniers décideurs, disons au niveau de nos pays, ce sont nos gouvernements pour que les questions ou bien les recommandations que les jeunes ont pu formuler puissent déboucher en des actions concrètes. Est-ce que vous pensez qu'il y a une possibilité que cela soit fait?
James, would you like to respond?
Yeah, okay, I'd like to respond, if I may.
Okay, yes, please do.
Okay, so one, as has been stated before, the way you do your sampling is critical. So if we look at your sampling size, it was 94 businesses. Already we need to know how you did that kind of stratification and ended up at 94 for that to be something that the government would want to implement or use as a policy. So we have to look at your way of analyzing your data before we can say your conclusions are concrete enough for any government to take seriously. That's one of the key areas. The second thing is we need to look at what you're recommending and breaking it down to actionables for them to see how to be implemented, I think. Thank you.
Okay, thank you all very much. We are now out of time, so I will wrap up. This was a really interesting session. I really enjoyed it. Thank you to our 3 teams from Africa for being the first to go ahead and try to work through this with not knowing exactly how it was all going to work. And again, thank you to Dr. Austin, Dr. Jacqueline, and Dr. James. I think you've all given some really interesting points for the teams to think about. Of course, with the limitations, the studies have been completed, but I think it is important to to take account of those when you're making recommendations about what those limitations are and the conclusions that you can draw. So I hope that you all enjoyed the session. Please do reach out to each other through the platform, ask questions, connect with the team members, and please do join us at the other sessions throughout the rest of the next couple of days. So a big hand of applause to all of our speakers today and their teams that they worked with. Thank you so much.
Au revoir.